Welcome to our second presentation, based on the exhibit featuring Presbyterian missionaries and Native Americans. Last week, we explored the missions of the Southeast, primarily to the Cherokee and the Choctaw, and followed their journey to Oklahoma. Today, we're going to examine a very different part of North America, the Pacific Northwest, Minnesota, and the Northern Great Plains. In the early 1830s, just as it was becoming obvious that the Native Americans in the Southeast would be removed, a small contingent of Nez Perce Indians from the Pacific Northwest journeyed to St. Louis, which was quite a journey in the 1830s. They were looking for Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They hoped that these two explorers would help them to acquire black robes and the Book of Heaven. But what did they mean? Deeply spiritual, as were most Native Americans, the Nez Perce wanted what their Spokane neighbors had received as a result of their chief's son attending an Anglican mission school in the Red River Valley. They wanted the power of education and saw it transmitted through religion. Eastern missionary publications lost no time describing various accounts of this story, and recognizing a fertile field when they saw it, missionaries began the migration to the Pacific Northwest. In 1835, Dr. Marcus Whitman, a physician, journeyed to the Oregon Territory to scout out a mission site under the auspices of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. If you were with us last week, we noted that this organization, founded by Presbyterians and Congregationalists, supported quite a few missions. The following year, he returned to the site, which is near present-day Walla Walla, with his new wife, Narcissa, Reverend Henry Spalding and his wife, Eliza, and other missionaries. Narcissa and Eliza were actually the first women to make the complete passage of the Oregon Trail. Now, from the perspective of the ABCFM, they were not particularly successful. Discord had plagued the group on the journey, and so the Whitmans and the Spaldings established separate missions, which is not necessarily the most efficient approach. Although the Whitmans opened some day schools, provided medical care, and organized churches among the Cayuse, they counted few converts, and they failed to establish leadership within the tribe. Their experience was far different from that of Cyrus Kingsbury, whom we discussed last week, and the trust that he won with the Choctaw. So why was the experience of the Whitmans so different from Kingsbury and the Choctaw? The strict Calvinist message of these missionaries, untempered by much in the way of empathy, certainly did not blend well with the theological underpinnings of an Indian spirituality. And then there is that oh so hard to describe issue, compatibility. Kingsbury lived with the Choctaw, and he was accepting of them. Whitman, it seems, was more dogmatic than flexible, more concerned with saving souls than knowing people. An outbreak of measles, for which the Indians had no immunity, shortly after a wagon train had passed through, effectively ended what had been a tenuous existence at best. When Whitman could not cure the Indians, they blamed him for the deaths, which was in keeping with their tradition that the medicine man was responsible for the lives of his patients. In November of 1847, just a dozen years after they had arrived, a group of Cayuse attacked the settlement, killed Whitman, his wife, and 12 others. The ABCFM completely abandoned this mission. Henry Eliza Spaulding had not been with the Whitmans, and so they were able to escape. They settled first in Oregon City and later in Brownsville, engaging in church and educational work among the settlers that had arrived. In the 1870s, Henry was able to renew his mission work among the Indians under the auspices of the PCUSA Board of Missions, the same organization that took on the care of Goodland Academy with the Choctaw in Oklahoma in the late 19th century. We will continue to see this trend of the PCUSA picking up when the ABCFM shifted its focus. But back to the 1830s. In 1835, just as the Whitmans and the Spauldings were arriving in Oregon, the ABCFM sponsored another physician, Thomas Williamson, who was also licensed to preach, to open a mission near Lac qui Parle in Minnesota. It was along the very western edge of today's state boundary, more south than north. Unfortunately, even as his group arrived, tribal lands were being taken in small pieces here and there, and the missionaries were forced to move several times. Joining them during this time was Stephenriggs. Now, he was quite a bit different from Williamson, from the Whitmans, and from Cyrus Kingsbury. Missionaries, even from one denomination, such as the Presbyterians, were not all cut from the same cloth, and personality had a significant impact on their work, as we saw last week with Blackburn and Kingsbury. Riggs saw Native Americans as trapped in the bonds of heathenism, not recognizing a deep spirituality because, in practice, it looked very different. We're not talking about cultural sensitivity here. Riggs was a skilled linguist, and in addition to his work as a missionary, he served as a government translator and interpreter. Quite unlike Kingsbury, he supported the concept of breaking up Native American way of life and certainly did not oppose relocation. For Riggs, understanding the Dakota language was a communications tool that he used both for religious purposes and to help the government further its removal policy, which is just what the government had hoped for. All of the settlements were disrupted by the Dakota War of 1862 and, you guessed it, the subsequent removal of the Dakota to present-day South Dakota. Neither Williamson nor Riggs traveled with the Dakota to their new reservations. Williamson remained in Minnesota and spent much of the rest of his career translating the Bible in conjunction with Riggs into the Dakota language. Riggs remained based in Wisconsin, although he did travel to reservations in South Dakota on several occasions. Following this removal, mission work expanded much more rapidly in the northern Great Plains than it had in the Pacific Northwest. The first Presbyterian mission in this region was begun in Yankton, in the very southeastern corner of present-day South Dakota in 1869. That same year, another mission began nearby in Flandreau. They even expanded into Montana territory, with two missions opening in the early 1880s. The final Presbyterian mission to the Dakotas was in Pine Ridge, which was begun in 1886. You're seeing now a sign of the Pine Ridge sign on your screen. The Presbyterian Center, fortunately, was fortunate to be able to acquire this sign, so it is currently in our permanent collection. This mission was begun on the Pine Ridge Reservation in southwest South Dakota. All of these missions were overseen by the Board of Foreign Missions of the PCUSA until 1893. And then they were transferred to the Board of Home Missions. And then in 1907, the board established the Department of Indian Missions, and in 1923, all American missions came under the auspices of the newly created Board of National Missions. My point here is that responsibility was transferred often, and that usually does not bode well for continuity. We're going to take a closer look now at Pine Ridge, which was begun by the Reverend C.G. Sterling and his wife. It was a large mission field, had about 5,000 Native Americans scattered in 9 settlements. By 1888, Sterling, who was much like Kingsbury in his relationship with the Native Americans, reported to the board that he and his assistant, a Native American by the name of John Fluke, were traveling among these various settlements, holding services in homes or schoolhouses. He bemoaned the lack of church buildings, complained that the, quote, Romanists are evidently about to push matters their own way, unquote, with a $40,000 boarding school. In other words, the Catholic missions were treading on his turf. The same report also groaned about government control that forbade teaching the Native Americans in their own language, and insisted that once a government school was opened in the region, the mission schools must be closed. How different the government position had become from the days when the ABCFM received government support. By this time, clearly, the government was unwilling to utilize missions as its vehicle for acculturation. In a lament of these times, Sterling wrote, and I quote, "Why should not the government let the mission schools alone? Why should it not treat them generously even, instead of pursuing a policy of interference, confusion, and destruction? Did a mission school ever unfit an Indian for being a citizen?" End quote. The government, of course, did not see itself as pursuing a policy of interference, confusion, and destruction. The intent, rather, was assimilation. Civilize the Native Americans, save them from extinction, and eliminate the fear that they incited in white settlers. Enter the Dawes Act of 1887, which was seen by the government as a thoroughly modern solution to this problem. It emphasized treating Native Americans as individuals rather than tribes. It authorized the breakup of reservations into individual land holdings and encouraged farming. Boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, begun in 1879, sought to transform Indian youth by immersing them into mainstream Euro-American culture. The idea of Indians being taught in mission schools by missionaries in their native language did not mesh well with this plan of assimilation. The result was a serious clash of cultures that erupted in Dakota Territory near the Pine Ridge Mission with the revival of the ghost dance. The ghost dance had begun earlier among the Paiute Indians, but quickly spread to other tribes, and it represented a symbol of hope, primarily among the Plains Indians. They believed that performing this ritual dance would bring spirits to fight on their behalf and to halt the westward expansion that was essentially threatening their very existence. The Dakota were particularly desperate because the government had once again reduced their reservation land and begun to enforce the Dawes Act, forcing them into farming. Well, even the hope of farming was thwarted by a significant drought, a harsh winter, and the near eradication of the buffalo in 1886. This severe weather pattern impacted not only the Dakota Indians, but also the frontier folk who had migrated to the area. One of the larger ranches, Elkhorn, was owned by Theodore Roosevelt. In 1884, he retreated to this ranch, distraught over the death of his mother and his wife in childbirth on the exact same day. He stayed there for nearly 2 years, living the cowboy life rather than the political life. That severe winter of 1886 completely wiped out his cattle and nearly half of his investment. Fortunately for Roosevelt, he could return to his fortune and his political life in New York. The Native Americans were not so lucky. And by the way, if you don't know anything about his daughter Alice, treat yourself to a biography of Alice Roosevelt Longworth. But I've digressed. The government feared the rise of the ghost dance because, of course, Indian agents did not understand the ritual and assumed that an armed attack was imminent. So the army sent troops to quell this incipient Indian uprising. Sitting Bull was arrested simply on the charge that he did nothing to stop the ghost dance. One Dakota fired at a soldier. The soldier returned fire, striking Sitting Bull. Deaths occurred on both sides, including that of Sitting Bull. 2 weeks later, as soldiers were confiscating Indian weapons, a shot of unknown origin rang out. The soldiers opened fire with their carbine rifles. Indian grabs some of their own confiscated weapons, and when the melee ended, 25 soldiers and at least 150 Indians were dead. When word of what occurred at Wounded Knee got back to the eastern United States, many Americans were horrified. They had been told that the threat of Indian violence had been removed. There was a huge public outcry over this, so much so that it led to a reversal of the government's policy, and the Dakota received significantly improved compensation. The Wounded Knee Massacre, as it came to be called, occurred very close to the Presbyterian mission at Pine Ridge, and Sterling addressed this in his 1891 report. The mission chapel, actually on the battlefield, was not damaged. Some nearby structures received some minor damage. No one affiliated with the mission had been injured. Sterling's report, which was fairly extensive, concluded that maintaining the peace involved the government keeping its pledges and the necessity of providing employment, both of which, he thought, would reduce the Indians' sense of helplessness. Imagine that. Interestingly, he also suggested that it would be important to control those who were insubordinate and to prohibit the ghost dance. And he insisted that the most important component was the continuation of mission work, concluding that in regions where Christianity had taken root, the ghost dance was of little consequence, which wasn't exactly the case. clearly, although he was empathetic to the Native Americans that he served, he didn't truly understand just how deeply the roots of frustration and despair ran. Certainly he did not understand the same way that Cyrus Kingsbury had. Kingsbury had been with the Choctaw prior to removal, during removal, and he remained with them until his death in 1870. He had lived their experience. Few other missionaries could say that, and I think that these accounts can help us have a better understanding of the modern mission field. Following this incident, religious missions continued with little disruption or violence. By 1923, the Board of Home Missions reported a total of 200 Presbyterian missions throughout the United States. It included 138 organized churches and a number of medical facilities. Just among the Dakota were 37 Presbyterian churches with about 4,000 members on their rolls, all incorporated into a very large, non-geographic Dakota presbytery. Perhaps in something of an overstatement, the report of 1923 claimed that 4/5 of the Dakota now profess the Christian faith. In 1972, what was to be a momentous decision shifted all work among the Dakota from the PCUSA and home missions to a synod function, the Synod of Lakes and Prairies. If you were with me last week, perhaps you remember that the same decision occurred nearly a century earlier in Oklahoma. When Cyrus Kingsbury died in 1870, all mission work became the responsibility of the local presbytery. Both decisions in 1870 and in 1972 generated a significant financial hardship for the presbyteries and the synod. The Dakota churches, with small congregations separated by great distances, were seldom self-sustaining. So in an effort to ameliorate this issue, the General Assembly in 1983 chose to eliminate all non-geographic presbyteries, and they provided a 10-year window for the logistics of this to happen. Now, it seemed like a good idea. Distribute the poorer churches among other existing presbyteries rather than have them in one large, geographically huge presbytery that actually overlapped the physical boundaries of other presbyteries. In effect, though, such a move would greatly reduce the cultural wholeness of the Dakota Presbytery that they so cherished. This decision on the part of the PCUSA represented yet another white miscalculation based on limited cultural understanding. The Native American congregations used much of their own language and had worship traditions that reached back for decades. Many of those traditions grew out of the initial process by which they folded Christianity into their own religious structure. And when the Dakota Presbytery met, it was much like a homecoming, like a giant family reunion. All of this would be gone. But this story has a happier ending than some of our earlier ones. Fortunately, members of the Dakota Presbytery used their collective voice to argue against this reorganization and, not without some difficulty, carried the day. Dakota Presbytery today is one of two non-geographic presbyteries honoring cultural traditions. Cyrus Kingsbury has to be smiling. We have many other accounts of Presbyterian missionaries to Native Americans, among them Sheldon Jackson in Alaska and Charles Cook in the American Southwest. If you can, plan a visit to the Presbyterian Heritage Center in Montreat to see our exhibit that features the complexity of this history and helps us to understand, at least in part, the critical intertwining of cultural sensitivity into mission work.